At the heart of Manhattan, a pair of skyscrapers pierced the sky, stretching 110 stories over the bustling expanse of Lower Manhattan. These were the famed Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, each reaching 1,368 feet. For a short time, they held the title of the world's tallest structures. Dubbed the final monumental endeavor of the Rockefeller dynasty, they stood as an emblem of U.S. economic might, forged from gleaming steel and glass to challenge the heavens. Yet this majestic edifice concealed a darker tale, one of a community razed to the ground. It told of countless modest enterprises wiped clean from the urban landscape. It revealed how unyielding authority crushed the defiance of everyday folks in pursuit of a dream, embraced by only a handful. This grand monument didn't emerge from barren soil. Instead, it ascended over the remnants of a place that authorities wished to consign to oblivion. The war concluded in 1945, and U.S. troops came back to a country reshaped by wartime industry, ready to embrace the rewards of peacetime abundance. Urban areas expanded with the influx of veterans and their growing households. New suburban developments, complete with fresh builds and budget-friendly loans, drew people outward. For an instant, it appeared that city centers might flourish in tandem with this outward growth. But Manhattan painted a contrasting picture. The financial hub, which had long sustained the nation's commerce, started shedding the qualities that kept it vital. By the late 1940s, major firms began shifting their bases to spots like Connecticut and Westchester County. Leaders favored spacious office parks with ample parking over the tight quarters, reachable only by public transit. Fiscal incentives made the transition even more appealing. This migration gained speed in the 1950s. Longtime occupants of downtown offices submitted new address notifications and vacated the premises. Blocks of structures sat half empty. Real estate prices dropped consistently. The revenue stream, supporting municipal operations, dwindled progressively. Uncharted territory loomed for New York as the country's richest metropolis observed its commercial bedrock disintegrate. The blow landed hardest in Lower Manhattan. The district below Chambers Street had been designed for a bygone 19th-century marketplace. Its tight lanes, meant for horse carriages, struggled with the surge of cars. Structures from the 1800s missed out on essentials like centralized cooling and swift lifts. Firms weighing upgrade expenses often chose to move elsewhere for smarter economics. No area captured the post-war shift away from such relics quite like Radio Row. This vibrant zone spanned about 13 blocks, hemmed in by Cortlandt Street, Liberty Street, Church Street, and West Street. Over half a century, it had grown spontaneously into the country's premier hub for electronics. Scores of compact outlets clustered densely, forming a trading ground without parallel elsewhere in the U.S. These were unpretentious ventures in time-worn low-rise structures, service centers mending radios and TVs, outlets peddling excess wartime gear from defense factories, vendors supplying essentials like vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, and wiring in all sizes. Stores hawked cutting-edge gadgets to shoppers at bargain rates. Most were run by families. A good number of owners were newcomers or their offspring who had turned modest startup funds, often just a few $100, into thriving concerns. The buildings mirrored their no-frills roots. Inexpensive 4- or 5-story edifices from prior eras. Front displays with large glass panes showcased goods piled high on racks. Upstairs levels contained workrooms where skilled workers handled detailed fixes. Top stories doubled as warehouses or simple living quarters. The design screamed practicality over flash, but it all operated seamlessly for its purpose. This very compactness fueled the district's success. Tech fans from the Northeast Corridor journeyed there often. Rare vacuum tubes, phased out by makers long ago, turned up in abundance. Vendors, armed with years of hands-on expertise, patiently broke down circuit mechanics for curious buyers. Learners from local trade institutes scoured aisles for bits to assemble homemade inventions. Corporate tech pros dropped in to gather supplies for testing new designs. The community ties were just as unique. Owners forged tight bonds with rivals, rooted in shared gains. They'd direct patrons to nearby spots if they lacked the right items. Chatter about fresh arrivals, dependable sources, and industry trends passed freely among shops. Plenty of today's bosses had begun as staffers in fellow Radio Row outfits, gradually saving up to launch their independent ventures. The neighborhood operated independently, maintaining its own standards and generating profits, without any need for external oversight. By the mid-1950s, the Radio Row enterprises directly supported around 30,000 jobs encompassing proprietors, expert repair specialists, retail staff, delivery personnel, and office workers. Yearly revenues probably hit tens of millions of dollars, though precise data was never gathered. These operations contributed property taxes, sales taxes, and employment taxes to the city's coffers during a period when municipal income was dropping in other areas. Beyond pure business, the district played a vital role in safeguarding and passing down technical expertise across generations via hands-on training. Long before formal electronics degrees were common, this area offered practical education through immersion. A young person fascinated by radio equipment might land a position as a store helper and absorb the skills on the job by observing fixes and working alongside seasoned pros. Such expertise sustained households for decades. Yet none of these achievements swayed the key figures shaping New York City's path forward. To city planners and elected officials assessing the Lower Manhattan zone, Radio Row embodied the outdated elements ripe for removal. Structures there were aging, traffic was jammed. Operations were modest in size. While it produced tax income, the district failed to embody the vibe of a cutting-edge international hub. David Rockefeller, however, viewed it through another lens. He spotted potential. He recognized prime land taken up by ventures that might simply be moved or shut down. He envisioned an empty slate, ready for groundbreaking development. Above all, he knew he had the financial means and influential ties to turn that idea into reality. Rockefeller entered the world in 1915 as the last child of John D. Rockefeller, Jr. When he reached adulthood, the family fortune had expanded into finance, property investments, and charitable organizations. The Rockefellers transcended mere affluence. They formed a cornerstone of American society, with their surname unlocking access denied to even other prosperous clans. David pursued economics at Harvard and obtained a Ph.D. from the University of Chicago. He spent a short stint in wartime intelligence for the U.S. military during World War II. In 1946, he began his career at Chase National Bank, soon to evolve into Chase Manhattan via merger. He advanced consistently up the ladder. By 1960, as chairman and CEO, he directed one of the globe's mightiest banks. His workplace was in the Wall Street area. He held significant holdings in Lower Manhattan real estate via familial trusts. As land prices started slipping in the early 1950s, Rockefeller confronted a pivotal decision. He might endure the slump and slowly pull out investments. Alternatively, he could pursue a bolder strategy, halting the downturn completely, with vast efforts demanding governmental authority on a historic level. In 1956, Rockefeller formed the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association. Its title implied a wide-ranging community alliance. Truthfully, it served as an elite advisory body led by Rockefeller and a tight-knit group of prominent landowners set to gain from urban renewal. The group brought on town planners and designers to examine the region and suggest fixes. Reports from the panel drew aligned findings. Lower Manhattan demanded sweeping change. The current infrastructure was outmoded. Road layouts hindered flow. The area missed a landmark initiative to lure big companies and reclaim status. Tiny outfits, such as Radio Rows, couldn't yield the leasing fees to cover high-end builds. Per the analyses, the zone called for total wipeout and renewal. Full sections had to be bought up, raised, and swapped for sleek high-rises. The effort's magnitude would demand huge scale for viability, and the organization behind it required authorities beyond any single builder's reach. Rockefeller pinpointed the tool. Established in 1921, the Port of New York Authority was a bi-state body overseen equally by New York and New Jersey. Though initially focused on transit systems, it wielded remarkable authorities. It had the right to seize land via eminent domain. It could sell debt securities supported by projected earnings, not public funds. Local building codes didn't bind it. Most vitally, it reported to state leaders, bypassing municipal boards or executives. By 1960, David Sibling Nelson was in his second stint as New York's governor. The Rockefeller clan thus held sway over it all. They possessed the blueprint for reimagining Lower Manhattan, along with a substantial share of the political apparatus essential for bringing it about. The Port Authority had just finished a number of large-scale initiatives and was hunting for fresh endeavors to validate its purpose and broaden its assets. The elements were starting to align. Research from the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association had pinpointed the core issue. The Port Authority supplied the vital legal and monetary capabilities. The Rockefeller brothers wielded the required political determination. The only tasks ahead involved choosing an exact location and formulating a plan persuasive enough to surmount the foreseeable pushback. Radio Row claimed some of the most valuable land in the area. Those 13 blocks lay right next to the Hudson River's edge. The spot promised stunning vistas and straightforward connections to New Jersey through the tunnels the Port Authority already managed. Above all, the district could be depicted in terms that made its demolition seem reasonable. The shops were modest and lacked collective strength. The structures were dated and unappealing. Officials could easily deem the zone rundown with minimal backlash from the public. Hardly anyone beyond the electronics sector would grieve its erasure. Moreover, the 30,000 positions there could be downplayed as insignificant, next to the high-status corporate roles that the planned growth was expected to draw in. By 1960, the Rockefellers had settled on clearing out Radio Row. In its stead would emerge a development that would revive the stature of Lower Manhattan and protect the family's holdings in downtown property. The endeavor would be vast enough to reshape the whole neighborhood, carried out by an entity that the local merchants couldn't realistically contest through legal channels. The district was merely biding its time. The vendors unlocking their storefronts every day remained oblivious to the impending upheaval. In a matter of months, initial announcements would hit the public. In just a few years, demolition teams would show up. The enclave that had grown organically across decades would get only a brief window to vanish. The initial hurdle involved fiscal constraints. Independent developers had surveyed Lower Manhattan and backed off. The numbers simply didn't add up for profitability. Purchasing those 13 blocks would run into tens of millions even before tearing down a single structure. Cleanup for environmental hazards, enhancements to utilities, and groundwork for foundations would tack on tens of millions extra. Building costs for skyscrapers high enough to render the venture feasible would climb into the hundreds of millions. Even supposing a developer secured such funding, demand was lacking. Firms were relocating to the suburbs, shunning fresh city office spaces. Persuading major businesses to sign extended leases in a declining area would prove extraordinarily difficult. The monetary peril was immense. No private group would shoulder that burden. The municipal administration offered no solution. New York City was already grappling with hefty shortfalls in its budget. Mayor Robert Wagner lacked resources for enormous property ventures. The city struggled just to upkeep its current facilities. let alone fund the erection of the planet's loftiest structures. While city-issued bonds could handle modest undertakings, they fell short for the ambition Rockefeller had in mind. That scenario pointed squarely to the Port Authority. The organization could tap into funding via revenue bonds secured by fees from bridges and tunnels. It enjoyed statutory authorities that bypassed typical city restrictions, and, most importantly, it faced its own dilemma. The Port Authority required innovative initiatives to affirm its relevance and retain its personnel. Its core focus had long centered on transport links between New York and New Jersey. Yet by 1960, the bulk of those key efforts had wrapped up. The George Washington Bridge handled vehicle flow over the Hudson. Subterranean passages connected Manhattan to New Jersey under the waterway. Harbor setups in both states had received updates. Absent ongoing builds, the entity risked fading into obscurity. Austin Tobin acted as the Port Authority's top executive. He had molded it into a formidable, semi-public enterprise. Over his 20 years at the helm, Tobin recognized that entities must expand or wither. Inaction would lead to losing skilled planners and managers to rivals. It would also see their sway diminish as politicians probed the need for such sweeping authority. The World Trade Center idea gave Tobin precisely the boost he sought, an enormous build that would keep agency workers busy for an extended period, a high-profile initiative to boost the organization's standing, and a funding model that might sustain itself via occupant payments, sparing public funds. Rockefeller and Tobin kicked off in-depth talks in 1960. These discussions remained confidential, without any official disclosures or involvement from local residents. Both leaders understood the dynamics of major undertakings, craft the full blueprint in advance, then roll it out to the public as a done deal. Seeking feedback too soon just handed ammunition to potential critics. The political setup was remarkably advantageous. As New York's governor, Nelson Rockefeller held sway over the state's share of the Port Authority Board. Persuading New Jersey's governor might take some effort, but it was feasible. The initiative promised thousands of building jobs across both states and would boost tax collections. Resistance from politicians could be diffused with appropriate perks. By 1961, the core idea was locked in. The Port Authority would construct a World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan, featuring office spaces for global trade entities and firms involved in worldwide business. The iconic Twin Towers would stand as the centerpiece, soaring high enough to eclipse the Empire State Building and reclaim the crown of tallest structures on Earth. Next came choosing the spot. Various sites in Lower Manhattan underwent review, each with its pros and cons. Yet Radio Row consistently emerged as the prime option in the assessments. The property values were low due to the aging structures. The enterprises there were modest and scattered, so no dominant force held sway over big chunks of land. Its position next to the Hudson provided stunning vistas and easy access to Port Authority tunnels. Above all, Radio Row could easily be labeled as rundown, a key label for both legal and PR reasons. Eminent domain, the authority allowing governments to take private land for public benefit, demanded proof that the acquisition advanced a communal good, and that the zone in question was flawed or detrimental to the wider area. Blight's meaning was flexible. It might refer to dilapidated buildings, poor hygiene or security, low tax yields compared to possibilities, or just that experts deemed the existing setup suboptimal for prime real estate. Radio Row's edifices were indeed dated. No denying that. Plenty originated in the late 1800s or early 1900s. They had no centralized cooling. Lifts were cramped and sluggish. Wiring had seen improvements, but wasn't built for today's demands. Against modern benchmarks for top-tier offices, they were outdated. But outdated for skyscrapers didn't equate to useless for electronics sales, shops, and fixes. Those operations thrived without fancy features. They required cheap leases and being close-knit. The organic network that gave Radio Row its edge as a hub couldn't be duplicated in sleek high-rises where costs would balloon tenfold or 20-fold. The Blight label overlooked this nuance. Reports from the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association zeroed in on the building's shortcomings, ignoring if those gaps affected the people using them now. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. Radio Row qualified as blighted, so raising it benefited everyone, thus validating eminent domain. The merchants had zero heads up about this. Store owners were busy with stock, patrons, and rivals. They leased from building proprietors. Profits were slim for most. Few possessed the clout or ties to uncover the secret talks between Rockefeller and Tobin. On January 28, 1960, the Port Authority teamed up with the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association for a joint media event. They revealed blueprints for a World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan, complete with sketches of twin spires surpassing all current heights. The venture was pegged at $280 million. It aimed to reshape the skyline and revive the district's commercial pulse. The reveal pinpointed the site as the block enclosed by VZY Street, Liberty Street, Church Street, and West Street. Locals knew right away what that meant. Media reactions to Radio Row were mostly positive. The New York Times lauded the boldness. Opinion columns hailed the idea of sleek high-rises supplanting worn-out districts. Finance pages dissected the benefits, forecasting vast job creation in construction and hefty tax gains. The storyline was all about advancement, updating, and city rebirth. This was the 1960s. Vintage gave way to fresh. That was urban growth. Tucked amid the reports were passing nods to the shops facing relocation. The New York Times reported that around 800 small stores filled the area. Estimates put the number of jobs at a few thousand, although no precise count was ever confirmed. Overall, the coverage framed these losses as regrettable but inevitable side effects of essential advancement, short-term setbacks that paled against the broader advantages. Owners of the Radio Row enterprises first heard about the scheme through the press. Neither the Port Authority nor the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association reached out to them ahead of time. Without any prior warning, the initial hint that decades of their labor faced destruction hit them via the daily headlines. Oscar Nadell ran a store selling radio components on Cortlandt Street. He'd managed it for more than 3 decades, taking over from his father who founded the operation. Nadell grew the enterprise, supported his household with its earnings, and kept a handful of staff on payroll. Profits came in steadily, if not extravagantly. The premises were plain, but the costs were reasonable, and the spot couldn't have been better suited to dealing in electronics. As Nadell absorbed the news, shock set in. His structure was marked for teardown. The store would have to pack up and move. Payouts hinged on valuations done by the Port Authority itself, the very entity eyeing his land. Resistance wasn't an option. Officials deemed his outlet an obstacle in their path. He reached out to fellow proprietors, sparking a flurry of shared concerns. Did the Port Authority truly have the right to pull this off? What protections did they have? Was battling the seizure feasible? To where might they shift operations? What sums could they expect? Who held the answers? The merchants started banding together, creating the Downtown West Businessmen's Association. Nadell stepped up as a key voice. They scraped funds to bring on attorneys. The council examined the agency's reach and offered grim insights. It wielded sweeping rights to seize land for civic needs, with judges routinely backing official assertions that such ventures advanced the common good. Contesting the rundown label, dubious as it seemed, would prove an uphill fight. Still, the legal experts spotted possible cracks. The Port Authority's founding charter centered on transport networks, not erecting commercial skyscrapers. Could they validly argue that high-end office spires served a public aim? Did hosting global commerce bodies warrant uprooting property from U.S. mom-and-pop operators? Such issues could spark viable court challenges. Beyond litigation, the owners launched a media push. They welcomed journalists to Wander Radio Row, showcasing active outlets buzzing with patrons rather than dilapidated ruins. Reporters spoke with owners, recounting years of nurturing their ventures. Coverage highlighted the area's financial value to the locale. Public perception nudged toward change. Perhaps this wasn't pure forward momentum, supplanting outdated relics. Perhaps influential forces were dismantling a thriving enclave for self-serving profits. In response, the Port Authority hastened its schedule. Any slowdown just let critics rally support and momentum. Tobin urged swift nods from the board, prompt assessments of holdings, and prompt seizure actions. Speed minimized chances for real pushback. Come 1962, the divide stood stark. Backed by the Port Authority and Rockefeller allies, the juggernaut commanded resources, funds, and sway in high places. Radio Row's proprietors clung to moral high ground, but scant more. They could sue, rally the press, and lobby politicians. Yet they couldn't block bond sales, derail board decisions, or dismantle the principle that takings for public use under eminent domain held up in law. The district faced maybe 5 years until bulldozers rolled in. Stores kept their doors open, buyers kept showing up, but all knew the commercial hub clung to fleeting days. The Rockefellers had sealed radio's destiny long before in closed-door sessions. All else was mere formality. For the World Trade Center, the Port Authority sought an architect of stature, not merely competent, but one whose global acclaim would elevate a divisive endeavor. A designer proven able to craft the planet's loftiest structures, one ready to navigate the limits Tobin and Rockefeller had set. Their pick, Minoru Yamasaki. The decision layered ironies overlooked back then. Yamasaki, a Japanese-American, had endured the wartime internment measures during part of World War II. Now, Yamasaki found himself tasked with creating the pinnacle of American free market success on property taken from modest entrepreneurs via governmental authority. Born in Seattle in 1912 to parents who operated a modest enterprise, he had pursued architectural studies at the University of Washington, financing his education with odd jobs. Upon completing his degree, he relocated to New York, climbing the ranks in several companies through sheer skill and determination, even amid the prejudice that Japanese Americans encountered in their careers. The outbreak of war brought Executive Order 9066, which mandated the relocation of Japanese Americans away from the West Coast. His relatives ended up in detention facilities, while he dodged that fate solely because of his East Coast residence. Yet the ordeal left a deep imprint on him. He had seen his family stripped of their lifelong labors, simply because officials deemed their location a problem. By the start of the 1960s, Yamasaki had risen to prominence as a noteworthy designer. His work prioritized illumination, expansiveness, and proportions suited to human needs. He held that structures ought to uplift and soothe those within, rather than dominate. His creations incorporated subtle flourishes, organic substances, and thoughtful consideration for practical human movement. However, the World Trade Center Commission forced him to set aside nearly all such ideals. The blueprint was fixed in advance, twin structures each reaching 110 floors with vast floor areas to fit expansive corporate setups and outer walls bearing the weight to forego internal supports. The sheer magnitude alone clashed with Yamasaki's core views on compassionate design. Still, he took on the job. The explanation was straightforward. This represented the grandest building endeavor globally. Rejecting it would spell career ruin. Any doubts regarding the proportions or the backstory could be brushed off as mere concessions, no different from those any designer encounters, just amplified for a substantial payout. Yamasaki's final concept sprang as much from technical demands as from creative intent. Skyscrapers of such stature contended with intense wind pressures. Conventional steel skeletons paired with non-load-bearing outer panels proved inadequate. Instead, the exterior had to shoulder the building's weight, forming a rigid tube to counter sideways stresses. Their approach involved a skin of tightly packed upright aluminum pillars. Every pillar measured 18 inches across and sat only 22 inches from its neighbor, yielding a tight, repeating pattern that gave the appearance of metallic sheeting draped over the forms. Though the slim window gaps stemmed from structural needs, Yamasaki insisted they offered a mental benefit too. Supposedly height-averse himself, he argued that the dense mullions shrank the perceived openness of the views, reducing vertigo. Moreover, those panes were fixed shut, a common feature in contemporary high-rises, reliant on controlled atmospheres for heating and cooling. That choice carried repercussions. Those inside got no natural ventilation or autonomy over their surroundings. Toiling in airtight enclosures, wholly reliant on HVAC for well-being and breathable air. To soften the immense proportions, Yamasaki incorporated other features. The spires would emerge from an upper-level public square, adorned with artworks, water features, and greenery. Lower levels would host eateries and retail spots, fostering communal areas. The entrance halls aimed for brightness and vastness, with high vaults that conveyed a sense of importance to arrivals. Yet these touches failed to offset the inherent impersonality of the scheme. Each tower would contain 50,000 employees, a level of crowding never seen before. Handling vertical transport demanded radical advances. Standard lifts couldn't manage 110 levels without chaos. Yamasaki collaborated with engineers on a multi-tiered hub setup. High-speed cars would whisk riders to transfer points on the 44th and 78th levels, from which shorter runs would reach targeted zones. The technical ingenuity shone through. The daily reality for users felt isolating. Staff navigated uniform levels piled high above one another, powerless over climate or ventilation. They depended entirely on the lifts for access and departure. A single failure in the infrastructure could ensnare thousands. Yamasaki avoided voicing these tensions in public. In profiles, he highlighted the stylistic nuances, balanced ratios, and how sunlight danced across the metal exteriors. He framed the complex as a triumph of empathy, embodying global partnership and trade. Promotional brochures depicted sharp-suited professionals thriving in spacious offices, boasting stunning vistas. Nowhere did they mention the harsh truth. The towers were rising on ground seized from reluctant property holders. The Port Authority's marketing glossed over Radio Row entirely. Their story centered on advancement and innovation, sidelining the upheaval and demolition involved. Yamasaki played along with this curated version of events. He might have felt compelled to do so, or maybe he truly saw the towers as advancing a noble cause that outweighed the sacrifices. As Yamasaki polished his blueprints, the courtroom fight over Radio Row grew fiercer. In 1962, the merchants launched a lawsuit disputing the Port Authority's power to seize their holdings. Their attorneys contended that erecting high-end office skyscrapers didn't qualify as a public use under eminent domain statutes. The Port Authority fired back, insisting the World Trade Center would fulfill vital civic roles. It would accommodate global trade bodies. It would offer workspace for state offices. The complex would boost trade and regional growth. Such communal benefits, they said, warranted the takings. The dispute climbed to the New York Court of Appeals, come March 1963. The panel sided with the Port Authority. The justices bought the case that fostering worldwide commerce amounted to a valid public goal. The _0_ label slapped on Radio Row faced little scrutiny. The core complaint, that officials were grabbing private land to enrich other private players, got brushed aside. The decision hit like a thunderbolt. It cleared the final hurdle for seizures. Now the Port Authority could launch valuations and enforce buyouts. The vendor's best defense was gone. They'd run out of judicial options. No influential backers stepped up to sway the outcome. David Rockefeller and Austin Tobin emerged victorious. Valuations kicked off right away. Port Authority evaluators scoured Radio Row sites, inspecting structures and operations. They pegged worth using formulas tied to buildings, real estate, and estimated earnings. The approach routinely shortchanged the true losses. A structure bought long ago for $20,000 could fetch just $30,000 in appraisal, nodding to land gains but overlooking rising prices or rebuild expenses. The unseen worth of established goodwill, loyal patrons and prime spots, barely registered. Expenses for shifting stock, securing fresh premises, and regaining foot traffic got scant attention. Oscar Nadel's electronics store came in way below his estimate. Inspectors reviewed his rental agreement, stock, and regulars. They pegged a so-called fair price. Nadel saw it as ridiculous. His operation sustained his household and staff comfortably. Uprooting it would run far pricier than the payout. Rebooting at 60 wasn't feasible. Scores of fellow proprietors got the same grim report. Awards fell short. Deadlines tightened. They faced mandatory sales and exits in mere months. Many were seniors. They'd counted on running things a bit longer, then cashing out to buyers at full value before bowing out. Instead, the Port Authority dangled scraps of what eager purchasers would have offered. The owners pushed back with talks. They sought bigger valuations, extended periods, help with moves. The agency budged only slightly. Tobin aimed to vacate the lot and break ground fast. Any holdup invited fresh pushback or meddling from poles. The quicker Radio Row vanished, the better for erecting the World Trade Center. By 1964, a few proprietors inked deals. They had little recourse. Courts were tapped out. Advocacy fell flat. Holding out just meant forfeiting more with slimmer returns. Initial stores shuttered. Holding fire sales to dump goods, longtime builders saw their legacies auctioned off for chump change. The neighborhood began splintering. Certain owners shifted to distant city zones. The tight-knit electronics hub that fueled Radio Row's appeal couldn't reform anywhere else. Outlets spread thin across boroughs forfeited their edge of easy access. Shoppers, once strolling block to block for deals and parts, now trekked town-wide. The whole network unraveled. Some proprietors just called it quits. They pocketed the meager sums and walked away. Scouting spots, haggling rents, courting crowds anew. It all loomed too daunting, particularly for veterans who'd poured in lifetimes of work. Many shopkeepers shuttered their stores, accepted the Port Authority's payout, and sought to come to terms with their defeat. A small number resisted. They turned down the offered deals, compelling the Port Authority to pursue court battles. Eminent domain cases stretched out in the legal system. These holdouts understood their fight was doomed, yet they aimed to create the greatest possible setbacks and expenses for the development. Unable to preserve Radio Row, they could at least extract a steep price from the Rockefellers and Tobin for its demise. Public attention faded over time. Initial reports on the underdog fight against overpowering forces shifted toward progress on the building site. Outlets that had once highlighted the merchants' struggles turned their focus elsewhere. Radio Row faded into the past. The World Trade Center embodied what lay ahead. Audiences were more interested in the skyscrapers than in the enterprises displaced to make room for them. Come 1965, the result was inevitable. Wrecking would commence soon after. Radio Row would vanish, paving the way for Minoru Yamasaki's towers to emerge from land, seized via state authority serving corporate goals. Demolition teams showed up in March 1966. The teardown of Radio Row started at the eastern edge of the area, advancing methodically west to the Hudson River. The Port Authority aimed to vacate the plot with utmost speed. Each additional month of holdup brought ongoing expenses and exposure to backlash. The initial structures razed were the tiniest and most aged. Workers punched holes in ceilings, toppled partitions, and carted off wreckage. Haulers clogged the roads, transporting wreckage to New Jersey dumps. The operation moved with machine-like precision. Edifices that endured 70 or 80 years crumbled in mere days. Former merchants who'd already moved out observed from nearby avenues. A few returned to see the erasure of spots where they'd toiled for years. Others avoided the scene, too pained to watch. Images from that season capture suited figures on the curbs, gazing at heaps of bricks and shattered timber that once housed their operations. Not all had departed. Several operators rejected the buyouts and ignored the seizure decrees. They kept their doors open, tending to patrons and pretending commerce carried on as usual. The Port Authority secured judicial approvals for forcible ejection. Municipal enforcers showed up bearing ouster directives. The stubborn ones were led out of their premises. Their belongings were dumped onto the pavement. Oscar Nadell ranked among the final to leave. He'd run his radio outlet for 33 years. Each item on display embodied insights into vendors, producers, and buyer demands. Departing equated to forsaking that hard-earned wisdom. Yet one April morning in 1966, officers rapped at his entrance and gave him just 2 hours to grab what he could. Nadell packed crates with stock. He abandoned the bulk of it. Packing it all rushed by too fast, and storage options were nil. The enterprise passed down from his father, which he'd grown into a viable concern, shrank to what squeezed into his vehicle. He departed as the demolition squad readied to dismantle the edifice. In under 7 days, it lay in ruins. The toll on lives reached further than the 800 proprietors. Every store had staff. Mechanics fixing radios and TVs, clerks guiding buyers to parts. Haulers shifting goods, clerks handling documents. Modest projections indicated 30,000 positions linked straight to Radio Row Ventures. The vast majority of those workers got no redress. The Port Authority dispersed funds to landlords and main entrepreneurs. Staffers with years or lifetimes in those electronic spots came away empty-handed. Their livelihoods ended when bosses were ousted. They scrambled for employment in a market already cutting back on factory and skilled roles. Certain workers trailed their bosses to fresh sites, though many had to uproot. Outfits ran slimmer profits amid steeper leases. They trimmed payrolls sharply. Full-timers ended up with cut shifts or outright dismissal. The fallout rippled into homes and neighborhoods. Home loans went unpaid. Kids' schooling schemes unraveled. Pension dreams got postponed or scrapped. Black and newcomer groups that had gained stable livelihoods via Radio Row suffered deepest. The area stood as a rare haven where repair prowess or part savvy trumped family name or complexion. Owners staffed by talent in wiring gadgets or sourcing pieces. The tech hub had opened doors to advancement for those barred by bias in other spots. That pathway vanished. Businesses that moved to different areas of Manhattan or to outlying boroughs failed to rebuild the same concentrated hub. The interconnected network of expertise, where novice repairers could hop between stores to pick up varied skills and establish their name, had vanished. Such prospects vanished alongside the district itself. The teardown pushed forward rapidly during the summer and autumn of 1966. Whole blocks disappeared. The urban layout shifted from packed storefronts to barren plots cluttered with rubble. A perpetual cloud of dust lingered in the atmosphere. The clamor of pneumatic drills and crumbling stone resounded across lower Manhattan. Areas adjacent to the demolition area suffered extended turmoil for many months. Come December, nearly all the edifices had been razed. Those 13 blocks, once home to countless structures, now lay vacant save for heaps of bricks, concrete, and mangled steel. Cleanup teams sifted through the ruins, salvaging whatever held value. Iron girders got sliced up and hawked as scrap. Ornamental features that could have been saved under different conditions ended up wrecked or misplaced. The Port Authority skipped any archaeological examination. There was no organized effort to catalog the architecture. A handful of picture-takers snapped shots of the destruction, yet no thorough archive survives of Radio Row's appearance in its closing days. The area got wiped off the map physically and almost from collective recollection. Media reports at the time zeroed in on the upcoming build, ignoring the fading locale. Stories spotlighted the bold feats of engineering needed for the planet's highest skyscrapers. They featured Minoru Yamasaki and his creative blueprint. They delved into the cutting-edge framework and lift setups. Radio Row merited just a passing nod as essential groundwork, if noted whatsoever. Clearing the ground sparked an unforeseen issue. Rubble from the 800 torn-down structures surpassed projections. Trucking it to New Jersey, dumps would run into millions in expenses and drag on for months. The Port Authority sought a quicker fix. They opted to toss the debris into the Hudson River. The wreckage of Radio Row got shoved into the waterway, right by the site's western border. Bricks, concrete, timber, panes, everything plunged into the flow. This disposal formed roughly 23 acres of fresh fill, pushing Manhattan's edge farther west. Battery Park City would later rise on that spot. The zone leveled for the World Trade Center effectively formed the base for yet another venture. Rules on the environment that would ban such practices later on weren't around in the 1960s. The Port Authority met no regulatory hurdles. Detractors voiced worries over river purity and aquatic habitats, but their protests held scant sway. Advancement demanded speed. The mess needed a destination. The waterway proved handy. By the start of 1967, the plot was cleared. 13 blocks in lower Manhattan waited bare, primed for digging and erecting. The shops had folded. The structures lay in ruins. The residents dispersed. Radio Row lingered solely in the recollections of its former laborers and in the archives of attorneys whose bids against seizure had failed. David Rockefeller stayed mum in public about the measures taken to enable the World Trade Center. He skipped any talks recognizing the obliterated quarter. His declarations centered on city rebirth, financial uplift, and New York's role as an international powerhouse. The toll on lives went unspoken. Austin Tobin dodged the subject too. Port Authority announcements hailed the launch of work on the globe's biggest edifice endeavor. They touted upcoming technical hurdles, the employment booms, and the glory the spires would deliver. The detail that the land had lately hosted 800 thriving enterprises got brushed off as mere backstory. Minoru Yamasaki joined in the hush. His chats and essays on the World Trade Center bypassed Radio Row entirely. He expounded on his aesthetic principles, his focus on fitting human proportions, his wish for the structures to motivate and elevate. He uttered not a word on the folks whose uprooting enabled his creations. The leveled ground now anticipated the following stage. Digging would need to hit the rock base 70 feet under the pavement. Engineers faced the challenge of laying supports without letting the Hudson River inundate the hole. Building demanded breakthroughs in substances, methods, and safeguards. The effort would span years and balloon beyond budget forecasts. Yet those remained engineering puzzles, Tough, no doubt, but conquerable with sufficient funds and know-how. The ethical dilemma, whether taking land from hundreds of mom-and-pop shop owners to erect high-end office skyscrapers truly benefited the public good. Music went largely unquestioned. Legal decisions had been made. The buildings were gone. The inquiries that deserved attention ended up lost amid the debris dumped into the Hudson's depths. Digging started in August 1966, prior to finishing the teardown. Creating the base proved the toughest engineering hurdle of the whole endeavor. To anchor securely, the skyscrapers had to penetrate solid rock 70 feet under the surface, yet in that part of downtown Manhattan, layers of dirt and centuries-old debris lay atop it. Only 300 feet westward ran the Hudson River. Standard digging techniques wouldn't suffice. Carving out a huge hole so near the waterway risked letting moisture leak in and swamp the area. The dig site might turn into a makeshift pond. The team had to devise a method for excavating depth while blocking water entry. They opted for a slurry wall. While familiar in European projects, this approach was unprecedented at such magnitude in America. Teams carved a groove along the site's edges, pouring in a blend of water and bentonite clay as they progressed. This thick mixture kept the sides from caving in. When the groove hit music, solid rock, crews inserted metal reinforcement frames into the mix, followed by concrete pumping. The hardening concrete pushed out the slurry, forming a lasting subterranean barrier locked into bedrock. Measuring 3 feet across and plunging 70 feet deep, this enclosure sealed the full, music, 16-acre perimeter against leaks. With it in place, teams could then drain seepage and safely hollow out the middle, reaching down to rock level. Beyond repelling the Hudson's flow, the wall integrated into the lasting base system. Building the slurry wall kicked off in early 1967. Custom machinery arrived, music from overseas. Laborers tackled the border groove in segments, roughly 20 feet apiece. Progress demanded caution and exactness. A single error might weaken the barrier and jeopardize music, everything. The overall dig displaced a staggering amount of material. About 1.2 million cubic yards of dirt and stone needed carting off. Like the raised structures earlier, it served music to expand land into the river. Around the clock, vehicles ferried batches to the edge. Music where machines shoved them into the flow. By the end of 1968, the pit stood ready, ringed by these walls. Across the 16 acres, bedrock lay bare. Now groundwork advanced. Crews laid concrete for the platform bearing the tower's weight. That underpinning alone demanded tens music of thousands of cubic yards. Meanwhile, steel production had raged for months at facilities in the Pacific Northwest. The framework innovated beyond norms. Conventional high-rises relied on internal steel skeletons with pillars scattered inside. Here, a tube frame system took over. Perimeter steel beams, set tightly, shouldered the bulk of the burden, freeing interior floors from supports. Every tower featured 240 such outer columns. These came as ready-made sections, 3 linked, covering music, 3 stories, with each weighing around 22 tons. They traveled music eastward by train from the West Coast, a multi-week trek. Timing everything perfectly proved essential. Initial beams rose in August 1968 atop the foundation of Tower 1, the northern one. Steelworkers positioned the hefty sections, securing them with bolts to the base and one another. The facade started emerging. Yamasaki's vision of tight rising pillars came into view. Tower 2, the southern counterpart, followed 6 months after. Officials at the Port Authority chose phased building to manage music expenses and apply insights from the initial structure to the next. The job carried real risks. Steel workers toiled at dizzying elevations regardless of weather. Gusts posed endless threats. The area's spot where waters converged bred music, erratic blasts. Gear for protection lagged modern ideals. Tumbles happened often. The initial death struck in January 1970. Ironworker Carl Coe plunged from the 44th level. Music. At 36, he left a spouse and kids. The Port Authority, Music, released notes on safety measures. Operations resumed promptly. Additional losses occurred before the finish. Tallies of total deaths sparked debate. Official Port Authority logs note certain cases, but probably shortchange the count. Fatalities among construction workers weren't always fully documented if they succumbed to on-site injuries days afterward in medical facilities. Tallies of deaths during the build varied widely, from as few as 6 to more than 12 music laborers lost. Every such loss shattered a household. These were expert craftsmen tackling hazardous jobs for pay that scarcely sustained an ordinary middle-class existence. They erected the skyscrapers that filled the Rockefellers and Port Authority leaders with pride, ultimately sacrificing their lives for that success. The building effort pressed on without pause. Come 1970, the twin structures were piercing the New York skyline. Their soaring stature grew evident as they overtook surrounding edifices, at 80 floors high. Nothing else in Lower Manhattan rivaled them aside from one another. Expenses ballooned right from the outset. The starting budget of $280 million turned out to be naively low. Groundwork issues drove up costs beyond expectations. Music, rising steel rates added to the burden. Payroll expenses outstripped forecasts. The cutting-edge design demanded bespoke engineering throughout music, each phase piling on costs that conventional builds would have avoided. In 1971, the anticipated overall price had climbed to around $600 million. By the time everything wrapped up, it topped $900 million. The Port Authority managed these hikes by selling extra bonds secured against income from bridges and tunnels. Still, the mounting bill stirred political backlash. Austin Tobin championed the endeavor, highlighting its gains for the public. The World Trade Center was set to host global trade bodies fostering business activity. It would offer workspace for public offices, music. The viewing platform would draw visitors. Such community perks made the outlay worthwhile. Officials glossed over the reality that most of the area would lease to companies at full commercial prices. Schedules fell behind, too. The blueprint targeted a 1972 finish. Setbacks extended that to 1973. Factors like inclement weather, union conflicts, music, and the immense challenge of erecting such lofty forms all played a role. The inaugural occupant settled into the North Tower that December of 1970. The Port Authority claimed its own offices there, marking it as the pioneer resident. This move served both utility and symbolism. Yet it exposed a harsh reality. External renters weren't clamoring for spots. The South Tower crested at its complete 110 floors in July 1971. Music. The North Tower had hit its peak just prior. The pair now claimed the title of world's tallest structures, each climbing 1,368 feet from the pavement. They eclipsed the Empire State Building. The formal unveiling occurred on April 4, 1973. Notable figures assembled to honor the biggest building venture in New York's past. Governor Rockefeller addressed the crowd. Port Authority executives, music, delivered talks on foresight and success. Minoru Yamasaki was present. The storyline spun was one of victory. Radio Row went unmentioned. Music. The 800 enterprises raised for the footprint got no nod in the proceedings. The 30,000 positions eliminated earned zero recognition. Households upended to enable the tower's ascent, stayed unseen amid the festivities. The record had been polished to excise the thorny elements. However, the structures themselves were poised to uncover a stark fact. They stood finished. They ranked as the planet's loftiest music, yet scarcely anyone sought office space within. The World Trade Center debuted facing a core dilemma. The towers held roughly 10 million square feet of music workspace. That outstripped the total in numerous full-fledged cities. Securing sufficient music occupants for that volume in an already saturated market posed a tough task. Luring lessees ready to fork over top dollar for a music less desirable locale seemed out of reach. Early 1970s, Lower Manhattan held little appeal for elite firms. Midtown had solidified as New York's corporate hub. Park Avenue, 6th Avenue, Madison Avenue. These spots signaled prestige. Financial institutions, legal practices, and big businesses huddled there, drawn by rivals and customers nearby. The World Trade Center faced another hurdle. Its spot felt cut off. Transit options paled next to Midtown's. The area went quiet post-work. Dining spots were scarce, cultural spots non-existent, shops limited. Staff in the towers endured long days in a zone that turned ghostly after hours. Port Authority research had forecasted robust interest from import-export outfits. Those hopes fizzled as overly rosy. Music. Firms in worldwide dealings found scant edge in a spot dubbed the World Trade Center. They prioritized reliable phone lines, easy access, and nearness to associates. An address in Lower Manhattan provided little of what those businesses required. By the middle of 1973, the buildings were barely occupied. The Port Authority had to take up considerable space in its own property just to prevent the humiliation of vast unoccupied levels. The New York state government rented out several floors, courtesy of Governor Rockefeller's influence. These public occupants filled a large share of the available area. But leasing from private companies was a disaster. Big firms displayed zero enthusiasm. The structures intended to revive the prestige of Lower Manhattan were spurned by the exact enterprises they were designed to lure. Real estate agents found it hard even to schedule viewings. The economic fallout was dire. The Port Authority had taken on almost $900 million in loans to construct the towers. Servicing that debt relied on income from leases. Yet with usage under 50% and rising at a snail's pace, the rents generated couldn't match the loan obligations. To bridge the gap, the authority began pulling funds from its bridge and tunnel activities. This sparked political backlash. The organization was meant to operate independently. Tolls from bridges and tunnels should have covered their upkeep alone. Redirecting that cash to prop up vacant offices broke the unspoken agreement with those paying the fees. In essence, daily commuters were footing the bill for David Rockefeller's misguided property venture. Detractors started labeling the towers as Rockefeller's architectural blunder. Articles challenged the vision of Minoru Yamasaki. The tightly packed supports were labeled stifling. The fixed windows and reliance on artificial air circulation turned the spaces into towering tombs. The surrounding plaza felt barren and harsh due to constant winds. Folks steered clear of it. The viewing platform atop the South Tower's 110th story debuted in December 1973. That turned out to be a genuine highlight. Crowds of visitors poured in. The panoramas were breathtaking. It brought in considerable earnings and sparked favorable media coverage. Still, fees from sightseers couldn't offset the void of unused offices. What the Port Authority truly required were steady corporate renters on multi-year deals. Such occupants remained elusive. Promotional campaigns ramped up. Agents dangled incentives and slashed prices. Even so, prominent businesses passed. The overall economy was worsening too. The 1973 oil shock drove up fuel costs and sparked a downturn. Businesses trimmed budgets and put off growth initiatives. Lavish new workspaces in an out-of-the-way spot were the furthest from their priorities. New York City was hurtling toward financial ruin. Decades of overspending, shrinking tax income, and lavish labor agreements had built an untenable mess. Come 1975, the city teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Lenders balked at offering more loans. The brink of New York's downfall turned into a nationwide issue. President Ford at first rejected any federal aid. In time, urgent financing was secured, but the metropolis faced harsh cutbacks. Programs were slashed, staff dismissed, upkeep on public works postponed, and crime rates surged. Such conditions offered no boost to leasing at the World Trade Center. Firms weren't growing in the city, they were fleeing. The outward shift to suburbs underway since the 1950s picked up steam. The towers loomed as symbols of an urban revival dream that commerce was dismissing. David Rockefeller's standing took a hit. He had pushed the World Trade Center as the fix for Lower Manhattan's slump. Rather, it had swallowed $900 million, razed a thriving neighborhood, and left behind partially vacant skyscrapers that siphoned Port Authority funds. Rockefeller kept steering Chase Manhattan Bank, though his sway in New York public matters waned. The project's shortfall in meeting goals eroded his standing. Opponents of raising Radio Row felt proven right. They had cautioned that wiping out a productive district for unproven high-rises amounted to flawed planning. The towers also posed upkeep headaches. Air conditioning guzzled vast amounts of power. Lifts demanded round-the-clock oversight. Maintaining 10 million square feet kept scores of staff busy non-stop. At under 50% occupancy, lease money barely covered daily costs, let alone loan repayments. Slowly, and with hesitation, conditions evolved. In the late 1970s, usage started to rise, driven not by elite corporations, but by modest outfits seeking affordable quarters at the discounted prices. Public bodies grew their footprints. Finance outfits, priced out of Midtown, snapped up levels in the World Trade Center. At last, the structures were populating, albeit without the elite global trade entities that had originally warranted the endeavor. The occupants consisted of everyday companies opting for practical choices on property expenses, yet they committed to agreements, covered their payments, and averted a total economic catastrophe for the structures. Around 1980, the space utilization climbed to about 75%. The Port Authority kept funding activities via income from bridges and tunnels, though the shortfalls had shrunk. Hopeful observers proposed that the skyscrapers could ultimately reach a balance point. The viewing platform kept drawing crowds of sightseers. The structures had evolved into a prominent feature on the New York horizon. Snappers captured them in urban panoramas. Movies depicting the city showcased them in key scenes. Entertainment trends were gradually shifting the buildings from being viewed as Rockefeller's blunder to an integral urban fixture. However, mere tolerance did not equate to vindication. The existence of the towers stemmed from the demolition of 800 modest enterprises. Construction relied on loans secured against projected earnings that required 10 years to emerge. The dream of revitalizing Lower Manhattan via elite initiatives had mostly fallen short. Business centers kept concentrating uptown and midtown. The Rockefeller clan avoided any open admission of these shortcomings or the tactics employed to realize the endeavor. In his much later autobiography, David Rockefeller would portray the World Trade Center as a triumphant city revitalization initiative, glossing over or ignoring the razed operations, uprooted employees, prolonged monetary deficits, every aspect. The edifices remained upright, they were populating, and they started fulfilling an unforeseen role. They emerged as icons, As the 1970s transitioned to the 1980s, the towers that debuted amid ridicule and vacant levels integrated into New York's essence, not via meticulous strategy or savvy promotion, but mere endurance. They persisted, they loomed massively. And bit by bit, individuals ceased regarding them as Rockefellers' era and began embracing them as skyline components. The viewing area turned into a top attraction for visitors. Each year, 2 million people ascended lifts to the 107th level of the South Tower. They shelled out fees to access windows on the world. The dining spot, spanning the 106th and 107th levels of the North Tower. The panoramas warranted the cost. At such elevation, Manhattan unveiled its layout in manners impossible from ground view. Visual media significantly aided the structure's evolution. Pictures of the Twin Towers surfaced on souvenirs and travel manuals in cinema. Filmmakers incorporated them in introductory views. Aerial captures of New York naturally featured them. The towers turned into a pictorial emblem for the metropolis. Globally, when folks envisioned New York, those paired blocky giants increasingly came to mind. The 1976 King Kong update climaxed with the colossal primate scaling the South Tower amid hovering aircraft. That scene ingrained the sights into mainstream media beyond any promotional push from the Port Authority. By the mid-1980s, space use hit 90%. The Port Authority at last gathered sufficient income to handle upkeep and loan obligations. The early fiscal woes were surmounted by tenacity and economic adaptation. Rates dropped to match rivals. The roster of renters mirrored this shift. Finance operations claimed several stories. Legal practices aiding the finance sector gathered close by. Official bodies persisted in renting areas. The global commerce groups intended as core presences appeared but lacked prominence. The towers operated like standard commercial spaces. The open area amid the towers fostered its patterns. Staff grabbed midday respites amid mild conditions. Entertainers engaged passers-by. The Fritz Koig artwork, a hefty copper orb at the heart, served as a gathering spot. The zone stayed blustery and stark, but activity filled it. Windows on the world drew upscale patrons. The eatery offered lavish cuisine amid stunning vistas. Corporate leaders hosted guests. Out-of-towners marked milestones. The locale stood unparalleled. Perched its seating on the 107th story as the metropolis stretched out underneath, delivered a sensation that backed the steep tabs. The towers additionally embodied U.S. market dynamics in layered fashions. Fans perceived them as emblems of drive, success, and fiscal might. The nation erected edifices surpassing any other's height. The towers demonstrated private sector and public partnership potential. Detractors perceived otherwise. They viewed the structures as tributes to business overreach erected atop the ruin of local ventures. Observers viewed it as a clear demonstration of how governmental authority might serve the elite while harming everyday citizens. Radio Row had been completely wiped off the map, yet the ethical dilemmas lingered on. Then, in February 1993, such concerns faded amid an act of terror. A truck loaded with explosives detonated in the subterranean garage under the North Tower. The explosion claimed 6 lives and wounded more than 1,000 others. Thick smoke permeated the structure. Around 50,000 employees fled via dimly lit staircases. The incident revealed weaknesses that few had truly anticipated. The skyscrapers themselves were now prime objectives. Their iconic prominence drew those intent on attacking the United States. What rendered them awe-inspiring also complicated escapes. Descending scores of floors with so many occupants demanded hours upon hours. In the aftermath, protective measures were bolstered. Entry for vehicles grew limited. Protective barriers went up. The Port Authority invested millions to fortify the entire area. Officials reassured everyone that the structures were secure once more. Daily routines resumed. The 1990s marked the height of prosperity for the World Trade Center. Tenancy rates stayed over 90%. Leasing revenues proved robust. The viewing platform and windows on the World Restaurant generated solid profits. The Port Authority had realized its grand plan. Albeit 2 decades behind schedule, many in New York came to cherish the towers regardless of their contentious beginnings. Those who labored inside daily formed strong bonds with the spaces. The panoramas were breathtaking. The edifices had integrated into the urban fabric. They shaped the routines of countless residents. The surrounding skyline had evolved with new constructions emerging, yet none rivaled their stature. The duo continued to reign supreme, noticeable from afar. As you neared Manhattan, they caught the eye immediately. They signaled the metropolis. By 2000, the World Trade Center had endured for 27 years. A full generation had matured, viewing those structures as fixtures. Children arriving after the opening recalled nothing of the prior district. Radio Row survived solely in records and the dimming recollections of its former vendors. The Rockefeller involvement had slipped from collective awareness. David Rockefeller had reached his 80s. His sibling Nelson passed away in 1979. The Downtown Lower Manhattan Association had ceased operations. The processes that displaced Radio Row were now mere history. The Port Authority kept managing the site. Yearly earnings surpassed $100 million. Upkeep was ongoing for the structures. But profitability had arrived at last. Construction loans were reworked at reduced interest. Minoru Yamasaki passed in 1986. His creations there stood as his signature achievement, although detractors claimed they contradicted his human-centered ideals. Yamasaki never commented publicly on the tension. The towers endured as his enduring mark. On September 11, 2001, the day dawned bright and clear. Roughly 50,000 individuals headed to their jobs in the towers. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower. 17 minutes afterward, United Airlines Flight 175 slammed into the South Tower. The South Tower gave way at 9:59 a.m. The North Tower tumbled at 10:28 a.m. In total, 753 perished. Structures that demanded 7 years to erect vanished in under 2 hours. The assaults elevated the towers from debated commercial hubs to hallowed territory. The community raised for their foundation faded from memory completely. The scant payouts to Radio Row proprietors lost all significance. The prolonged deficits in funding vanished from conversations. The focus shifted to the immense human toll. The location turned into a place of remembrance. The bases of the former towers became serene, reflecting pools. The victims' names were etched onto bronze surfaces. People arrived to grieve, reflect, and honor. One World Trade Center, erected on a portion of the old grounds, debuted in 2014. It soars to 1,776 feet, surpassing the originals in height. Its design incorporates defenses against future threats. References to Radio Row are absent from memorial displays. The 800 enterprises demolished for the project lack any marker or recognition. Oscar Nadell and fellow merchants who forfeited their livelihoods go unnoted in the annals. David Rockefeller died in 2017 at 101 years old. Tributes highlighted his charitable efforts and corporate prowess. The World Trade Center featured among his key accomplishments. The tactics employed to enable it went unexamined. The inquiry posed by Radio Row operators in the 1960s lingers unresolved. Can the state confiscate viable private enterprises' assets to develop uncertain commercial ventures for alternative private parties? The judiciary affirmed it could. The towers ascended accordingly, but distinguishing that capability from its moral justification remains a separate matter. For 28 years, the towers endured. During that span, they transformed from an initial flop into a permanent landmark and ultimately an icon. Despite their controversial beginnings, they grew deeply cherished. The tragedy of September 11th elevated them to a sacred status that their creators could never have foreseen. The shadowy tale of their creation faded under layers of grief and commemoration. The Rockefeller dynasty responsible for their erection has vanished. The community they displaced lingers only as a faded memory. Today, the towers live on solely through images, recollections, and the memorial pools marking their former site. Lingering still are inquiries into authority, into those who shape urban destinies, and into whether grandeur can truly excuse the ruthless paths taken to attain it.